Hello and welcome to the 7th part of this documentary series. If you want to watch previous parts, there will be links to those in the description. With that said, enjoy. With Teruel having just been retaken, Generalissimo Franco and his generals argued over what their next move would be. Precisely what went through their minds or how they debated the decisions is to this day unclear, but they decided that instead of pursuing another attack on Madrid as a shortcut to victory, they would press the advantage they had whilst the troops used to defend Teruel were deployed. It was here where the Aragon offensive would begin. On the 9th of March 1938, around 150,000 nationalist troops along with 700 guns and 600 aircraft attacked in the northeast with the intention to reach all the way to the eastern coast along the Mediterranean. The Republican defenders in their trenches were both outnumbered, outgunned, low on supplies, and utterly exhausted, so it is hardly difficult to see why they were completely blown away by the overwhelming firepower. With everyone in the way either dead or running for the hills, the nationalist advance was extremely swift and suffered very few losses, able to travel 36 kilometers on the first day. The Republicans were beset with hesitancy and internal bickering that had lingered since the failure of Teruel, and were unable to organize any sort of reaction to the attack. Ground was being gained so quickly that by the beginning of April the sea had been reached. Every town which found itself in the path of the onslaught either quickly surrendered or was bombed into oblivion. The attack stopped by the 15th of April after having taken over 100 kilometers of land and severing Catalonia from the rest of Republican territory, a resounding success. The Aragon offensive had split the Republican zone in two and was referred to as Franco's victorious sword. After this crippling defeat, virtually any chance the Republic had of surviving was completely gone. It would honestly be impossible to outline all the major problems that they were facing, but here is a rundown of some of them. To begin with, there was a huge amount of hyperinflation, with the cost of living estimated to have tripled within 2 years of the beginning of the war, without wages rising to compensate for it. Food shortages were endemic and basic consumer goods were scarce. Additionally, the Republic had almost completely run out of gold and hard currency which it needed to purchase weapons. Given that Spain had no arms industry of the sort, it desperately needed them from abroad, else it simply wouldn't be able to fight. Hence why all of Spain's gold reserves were now in Soviet coffers. This was not helped by the fact that many who sold weapons to the Republic did so at inflated prices because they knew that they were desperate for them. Numerous Republican cities were having to deal with repeated air raids by the Italians, especially Barcelona, which were taking their toll on an already broken war effort. These raids only picked up in late 1938. The Republican population had been beset by a massive crisis of confidence in their leadership. War weariness and cynicism were ever present in society's layers, especially amongst liberals and anarchists who felt betrayed by the communist takeover of the Republican elite. This was true even amongst military officers. And just when things couldn't possibly get any worse, the Republic's allies were ditching the cause. Stalin had concluded that the Republic was beyond saving, and Britain and France's policy of appeasement towards the Axis powers meant that they would refuse to lend any assistance. They were completely on their own, whilst the nationalists were still receiving backing from Germany and Italy. In a state of desperation, Juan Negrin decided to order a diplomatic treaty with Franco as a conditional surrender. His offer was to create a new Spain based on a compromise between the nationalist conservative principles and Republican values, but Franco rejected this. I mean, you would have to be pretty dense to accept any of the enemy's conditions at this rate. Meanwhile, the nationalist zone was hardly suffering from any of these maladies. It had never had to deal with a lack of food, as it had control of key agricultural areas. Because factory owners and managers had not fled like in the Republic, industrial production was up. It also had better monetary policies which curbed inflation. Military aid from Italy was cheap, as Mussolini was not very concerned about his own financial position. Sensing victory, Franco ordered the commencement of the Levante offensive with the goal to take the city of Valencia, just south of the recently captured territory. On the 25th of April, only 10 days after the end of the Aragon offensive, an attack of 125,000 men was launched. However, this attack would not have the same level of success. Bad rainy weather, along with the lack of airfields in the region, meant the Condor Legion couldn't be used for aid. The attack had to be halted so that it could be resumed on the 4th of May. Unfortunately, this meant a loss of the element of surprise, and it gave plenty of time for the Republicans to construct a fairly good defense of trenches and bunkers. Throughout May and June, the Nationalists slowly gained ground at the cost of severe casualties. Eventually, the attack was ended on the 23rd of July, being unable to cross the Levante, which is what would give the battle its name. The Nationalists had suffered a total of 20,000 losses, 4 times that of the Republicans. It was arguably the greatest victory for the Republic, but at the same time it gave the Republican generals the delusion that the war could still be won. This would soon be shown in the upcoming Battle of the Ebro. The attack on the River Ebro by the Republic would be the single stupidest decision made by them yet, if only the war wasn't already a foregone conclusion. The plan was a desperate attempt to reconnect Catalonia with the rest of the Republic by cutting through the division that Franco had created. This meant crossing the River Ebro, which would be a complicated endeavour, especially with the fact that the Nationalists had complete air superiority. The Republic gathered every bit of strength it could transport to the area to be used, which included the last remaining armour and aircraft at their disposal. This also included training and crossing of the river in boats for a week before the offensive would commence. A total of 80,000 men had been gathered. However, they were not as well equipped or professional as in the Battle of Brunete a year earlier, not to mention the fact that the preparation was hasty and haphazard. On the night of the 25th of July, the attack began with a covert assault by commander units who would reach the river and make preparations for the crossing of the army. At first, things seemed to go well, as they were able to set up pontoon bridges and allow a large number of troops to cross before the Nationalist defenders could respond. Unfortunately, that was about as good as things were going to go. Nationalists were able to quickly respond to the threat, and the Condor Legion quickly flew over to deal with them, where over 200,000 planes almost instantly gained air supremacy since the Republican Air Force was completely absent. Heavy casualties were inflicted from the air. As for the pontoon bridges, there was one minor but important detail which the Republican generals had not accounted for, and that was the fact that Franco controlled the dams upstream. This meant he could simply open them up to flood the river, destroying the bridges, which left all the Republican fighters on the other side of the river effectively trapped. After several days of bloody assaults, the Republicans had taken massive casualties, and by the 3rd of August, the attack had been completely paralyzed. This was all whilst the Republican Air Force, which had been meandering in God knows where before, had finally made their way to the scene, but were getting completely dominated by enemy planes. The Republicans were now trying to dig themselves in to defend the meagre territory they had conquered from the inevitable counterattack which was fast approaching. This was easier said than done, given that, just like at Brunete, they were in short supplies and couldn't easily resupply themselves, given that getting things across the river, while currently being shot at by planes, is almost impossible. A retreat was considered, but this couldn't be done as they were unable to go back across such river. The Nationalists would launch their first counteroffensive on the 6th of August. The fighting was rough and exhausting for both sides, as temperatures had exceeded a sweltering 37 degrees Celsius, and because of the desperation of the Republican troops that were stuck there, the vicious resistance meant that progress for the Nationalists was slow. Further counterattacks would be launched on the 31st of August and 3rd of September. By the end of the month, the Republicans had sustained about 75,000 casualties and lost almost all of their hardware to capture a minuscule and strategically irrelevant strip of land. These men and weapons would have been useful for the defense of Catalonia, but incompetent leadership had doomed that province to a swift takeover. In October, the international brigades which had served the Republicans departed. They did so in a glorious parade of over 300,000 spectators, accompanied by many of the Republican leaders. It was universally described as a moving and tear-jerking occasion, as they were praised as heroes and as an example of the international universality of democracy and freedom. The volunteers had suffered close to 10,000 deaths and gained a reputation for being some of the most committed and fierce fighters amongst any group in the war. This celebratory moment was rather brief, however, as soon the Catalonians would be defending their homeland from the imminent nationalist onslaught, preparations for which were already underway. In that moment, Franco was drawing battle plans for the offensive, gathering a force of over 340,000 men and 300 tanks behind the front line during November. The Republican allies had completely abandoned them, with France refusing to meet Negrin's request for more weapons and the Soviet Union ditching their last armament supply. Almost all of their planes were gone, and much of the hardware they could use to defend themselves had been wasted in the recent attack on the Ebro. The assault commenced on the 23rd of December, and as you can imagine, the defense, which consisted of a force that was not only outnumbered, but many of whom couldn't even be armed, got completely wrecked. Whilst they tried their best to resist, even managing a counterattack in Hinojosa, they were driven back all throughout January. In a state of desperation, the authorities decided to call for the mobilization of all citizens in the area of both sexes. But this was too little, too late, as even if they could get all the manpower they could, it was hardly as if they could be armed given the weapons shortage. Instead, a complete state of panic had gripped the general population in almost every social strata. Governors and bureaucrats were ditching the scene and running across the border to France, trying whatever means they could to conceal themselves from the advancing army, which would have them executed. By late January of 1939, pretty much everyone in the city of Barcelona could abandoned it. Whenever the nationalists arrived into urban areas, they spared little brutality. Everything which couldn't be bolted to the ground was looted, and about 10,000 people were killed in reprisals in less than a week. An interesting narrative had gripped nationalist high command, and that is that leftist ideology was a mental sickness, which is why soldiers were given the command to treat Barcelona, the center of anarchist radicalism, as someone who was ill. This probably explains the high level of looting, murders, and general rapaciousness. Whilst this was going on, a massive refugee crisis was occurring on the French border by Catalonians escaping the violence. It is estimated that up to 500,000 civilians crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, a number which the French government was woefully unprepared to take in. So they usually had the appearance of a mass of shivering, desperate, and pitiful people. France, while a little overwhelmed, allowed the entry of combatants into their borders and spent quite a large amount of resources trying to accommodate the refugees. Meanwhile, the Republican government was undergoing a complete crisis of leadership. The main body of legislation, headed by Negrin, just so happened to be in Barcelona when it was attacked, which meant that it now resided in France and it had to flee there to get away from Franco's clutches. When you combine this with the fact that they were massively unpopular, it made governing the Republican zone impossible. Negrin was willing to fight to the bitter end and telegraphed the movement in Madrid to do so, but his requests were ignored. The communists of the Republic had become utterly loathed by the liberals and the anarchists, and they saw them as having co-opted the government and failing to do a good job on top of that. Madrid had been cut off from the decision-making process, so the administration there felt alienated anyway. Instead, a national council headed by Colonel Casado disobeyed the orders on the 5th of March and mounted a coup against the government. They denounced Negrin on the radio and formed a provisional government. Negrin tried to fulminate him through the telephone from Paris as this went down, but there was really nothing he could do about it. He had lost pretty much all legitimacy. Once he had cemented his position and dealt with the opposition, Casado set about to negotiate some sort of peace deal with Franco, knowing full well that any fighting beyond this point would only lead to more unnecessary deaths for the cause. However, Franco also knew this and refused to offer any compromise of ideologies. Instead, he was talking pretty much like a victor, only accepting a complete and unconditional surrender, demanding that Casado raise the right flag. As these negotiations dragged on, Franco prepared for a final offensive on Madrid, which was launched on the 26th of March. All of Spain was now asking the question, would the Republicans surrender, or would there be a final bloody chapter in the struggle?